Hey there, my name is Chaos and thank you for joining me on the Retro Game Couch. Today's video will be about the history of the Commodore 64. Now the Commodore 64 has been in production for 10 years, starting in 1982, and during those 10 years Commodore produced a lot of different models of our beloved Commodore 64. Now I have a bunch of them lying around here which I would love to show to you, so let's go! So in 1982 Commodore produced their first Commodore 64 using its classic well-known breadbin shape, but it wasn't the first Commodore that used that shape. That is actually the Commodore VIC-20, which has the exact same shape and exact keyboard as the Commodore 64. This is actually the predecessor of the Commodore 64. And this was also a very successful computer for Commodore that sold millions of this. And this is where the shape of the Commodore 64 comes from. So let's get a very early Commodore 64. This one. And this looks exactly the same as the VIC-20, and only the color is different. They used a gray brownish color, and they changed the color of the function keys, and internally it's a completely different computer. So this is an early Commodore 64. Now the very first Commodore 64s, known as Revision A, actually don't use this rainbow logo, but they use a silver label. And I'd love to have one of those, but I don't. So this is one of my oldest Commodore 64s from 1982. I also have, and that's pretty cool as well, another very old Commodore 64, but this one has the orange function keys just like the VIC-20 does. Now I don't know if people themselves switched these keyboards or if this was done after a repair by Commodore, but the story I have heard is that if Commodore ran out of keyboards during production, they would simply put in VIC-20 keyboards into the Commodore 64 and ship them like this. So this was 1982. So next up is 1984, which was a big year for Commodore. They acquired Amiga, and they also sold over 1 million units of the Commodore 64. And to celebrate these great sales, they made a special version of the Commodore 64, which is basically a Commodore 64 breadbin dipped in gold paint, known as the Golden Series. And some say only 200 were made. I've read about 350 being made, but it's a very limited edition, and the first few of those were given away to employees and the other ones were given away at special events for partners. It's pretty cool that there is actually a golden Commodore 64. Now 1984 is also the year Commodore announced a different model of the Commodore 64, which was the Commodore 64 SX, which is a portable version of the Commodore 64. And that computer is actually credited as the first full-color portable computer of its time. So that's an amazing achievement. It's basically a Commodore 64 in a suitcase with a small display built in, and it weighed over 10 kilograms. So it's not really portable, but still a very good achievement of Commodore. So that is 1984. So next up is 1986, and in this year Commodore introduced a new version of the Commodore 64 known as the Commodore 64 C or the Commodore 64 2. And as you can see, they abandoned their classic breadbin shape and went for a look that looks a lot like the Commodore 128. Now the Commodore 128 is the successor of the Commodore 64. It's also the first Commodore 64 that has the words personal computer printed on it. It also uses a different mainboard. It's a shorter mainboard, it's a revision of the original mainboard, and it uses a different SID chip. It doesn't use the 6581, but it uses the 8580 SID chip. So this is a very different Commodore 64, looking a lot more modern, I guess. It's not my favorite Commodore 64, but this is the Commodore 64 that came out in 1986. In 1987, Commodore made a new version of the Commodore 64, and they made it exclusively for the supermarkets ALDI in Germany. And that looked like this. It's basically the old breadbin shape again, with the newer white keyboard like you saw in the Commodore 64C. This also has the shorter mainboard, the newer mainboard, and the newer SID chip. So this is basically a Commodore 64C in a breadbin casing, and it was only sold at the ALDI supermarkets in Germany. Pretty nice version. Came out in 1987. Next up is 1988, and the Germans get all the fun stuff because Commodore released the Commodore 64G, and some say the G stands for Germany. And this version was primarily made for the German market. I have two of these. It is basically a Commodore 64C like the ALDI, but with a white case. And this gives it the modern look of the Commodore 64, but uses the old breadbin shape, which most people prefer, I guess. And yeah, again, I have two of them because this is my favorite model. This one was made in China, I see, and this one was made in West Germany, when there was a West Germany. It even still has the seal on it. This is my favorite Commodore 64 version. Came out in 1988. Also in 1988, Commodore introduced a cheap, low-cost version of their Commodore 64C, and that is known as the Commodore 64 CR. And this is a Commodore 64C with a cheaper low-end case and parts. This doesn't have screws like the original does, but this has clips, and it just feels very plasticky. This is my least favorite Commodore 64, but this was the low-cost version of the Commodore 64C, which came out in 1988. Okay, so in 1990, Commodore tried to wiggle their way into the game console market, trying to compete with systems like the NES and the Sega Master System, and they introduced the Commodore 64 GS, and GS stands for Game System. They basically took a Commodore 64, removed the keyboard, removed a lot of the external ports, and put the cartridge port on top, so that you could only play games by inserting a game cartridge. It didn't sell really well. For me, it kind of defeats the purpose of having a Commodore 64. But the Commodore 64 GS came out in 1990. So, did I leave some models out? Yes, I did. There was a company called Drean in Argentina, South America, and that company was allowed by Commodore to make their own Commodore 64s with official parts and sometimes parts of their own, and they were allowed to rebrand those machines as Dream Commodore 64, and those were targeted at the South American market. I'd love to have one. They look pretty epic. There's also an Australian version of the Commodore 64, but I read that the case of the Australian version is actually an aftermarket case. Still, I'd love to see or have one. There's a Japanese version called the Max Machine, which is actually the predecessor of the Commodore 64. It's a horrible machine and not many were made, but still, I'd love to see one. And which am I still missing? Yes, I'm missing a Dream, the Japanese version, the Australian version. I don't have a game system, I don't have the portable version, and I don't have a Silverlabel. So these are the models that are missing from my little collection. So I hope you liked this video. If you did, please leave me a like. And for now, thank you for watching, and hope to see you next time on the Retro Game Couch.